Hi, this time I wanted to talk about some particular reasons as to why miniatures and maps are still used in tabletop role-playing games even after so many years. Because every now and then some people think that miniatures and maps could be obstacles when it comes to playing a tabletop role-playing game. Some others think that they are absolutely necessary. So I wanted to give my thoughts on this situation. I think it's important to go back and take a look at the origins of when miniatures and maps were used. Scenery elements and such were employed in the first tabletop RPG sessions. So without going too much on a tangent, many of you know that Dave Arneson was the one who came up with the whole Dungeons and Dragons concept. Dave Arneson is basically chaos, and Gary Gygax is order. So Dave Arneson had this creative chaos. He was the one who came up with the entire let's go into dangerous places and level up, and we obtain magical items and all of that. And Gary Gygax took those concepts and brought them to gave them structure. So each one of those creators, they had their flaws and their strengths. Dave Arneson was terrible when it comes to organizing his thoughts on instructing others on how to play a tabletop role-playing game, but he had the role-play essence perfectly laid out in his mind. But that's it, in his mind, but he couldn't actually communicate that in written form. And Gary Gygax took all of that and tried to communicate it, at least when it comes to the tabletop game aspect. He never quite understood the roleplay, in my opinion. If only they had learned to work together, I think Dungeons and Dragons could have been communicated in a very different way. But I still think that they were both necessary to get the tabletop role-playing game hobby started. But why did they start to use maps, miniatures, etc.? A lot of you already know that role-playing games, at least when in the beginnings, they were greatly influenced by war games. There was this set of miniatures and castles from the Elastolin brand. So when tabletop role-playing games first started, they serve as the tools, even the models to create adventure sites and encounters. Because the RPG concept was still quite new, they had to use the Elastolin. Yes, I think it was the Elastolin castle, because they had different structures to represent historical situations. Some other companies and individuals even published special war game scenarios telling you how you could use your Elastolin figures, your castles, scenery elements to recreate historical battles. So you can see how that took root there. You could say that Castle Blackmoor, was created because of that. And Castle Greyhawk is basically a tribute. Well, some would say kind of like a ripoff. In fact, the number Greyhawk, it was like a mirror version, like Blackmoor, Greyhawk. In fact, I think the hawk was originally going to be replaced with another word, but Gary Gygax thought that was too much of a tribute slash ripoff. So he used Greyhawk. If there are knowledgeable historians in the comments, please let me know about more details. If you know something I don't about that origin, let us know in the comment section. But okay, so you had this miniature castle, and at first Dave Arneson felt a bit confined, at least as I understand it, taking a look at the history. He was a bit confined to that adventure site, and that's why he came up with the idea of having these underground labyrinths or complexes. The whole dungeon concept came out of Dave Arneson noticing that his players had exhausted the rooms of the castle, and now he needed another place to explore, so he decided to go downwards. But later on, he developed the campaign into a proper tabletop role-playing game campaign, at least in my opinion, where you had these kingdoms and these threats from both outside and inside of the castle. There was intrigue. There were also many troublesome situations. At one time, the original Blackmoor group actually got kicked out of Castle Blackmoor because they spent so much time just looking for treasure under the castle and they were not protecting the kingdom. So yes, it's very interesting, quite interesting how that campaign developed. But you can see how that took root. But later on, I think that Gygax, even though he had his sand table, I think he was, well, based on what he and Rob Kuntz have said throughout the years, it's quite obvious that they sometimes preferred to handle things without miniatures, perhaps just with a few maps. Theater of the mind, so to speak. So, I think there are two main reasons as to why, despite all of that, people still were quite enthusiastic about using miniatures and maps, and perhaps even scenery elements. Well, first, I think that because many people were drawn into the hobby from war games, and perhaps, who knows, maybe from board games as well, they were quite accustomed to using miniatures and plastic aids, or whatever you want to call them, and boards and scenery and all of that. So it's only logical that those players that were more of a tactical mindset, they preferred to use your typical like dungeon tiles, maps, scenery elements, miniatures, because that way there would be no confusion, no arguments as when it comes to determining if a spell effect had some sort of, repercussion on your character. Is your character within the range of that fireball, or if you have like a positive or protective spell, are you still within the range of that spell to obtain its benefits? So there is no question as to who hit what, or who was affected by who, etc. In combat, when ranges became very important when it comes to ranged combat or close quarters combat, there would be no confusion whatsoever. No disputes as to, hey, no, I was too far away, that didn't affect me, or I'm still within the range, so I obtained the benefits of that. So it's all about that tactical aspect. But the other reason why miniatures, maps, scenery was still used later on is because Dungeons and Dragons started out as a business. So it's logical that you had all of these war gamers that were getting into tabletop role-playing games. They wanted to use their miniatures. So you would obviously encourage the use of miniatures, maps, scenery elements, or scenic elements, maybe you could say it like that. It's a way of pulling them in. And even nowadays, you can see how different tabletop role-playing games, they sell the miniatures and different like scenario packs. It's all about the business. So you can look at things that way. When it comes to miniatures and maps being an obstacle and sometimes a hindrance, or perhaps even useful tools, it all depends. In my opinion, I think it depends on the system. If I'm going to play any D20 based system with very specific rules concerning attacks of opportunity, cones of effect, templates, and all of that, I prefer to use maps and miniatures, definitely. And I never felt like they presented an obstacle when it comes to immersion and getting into the fictional setting. In fact, I have mentioned this in another video. I feel as if I can project myself into the miniature, like, oh, I'm looking at the world from the perspective of the miniature. And even if you are using like your typical dry erase maps or paper maps, the imagination just takes over. And I like that feeling, that sort of immersion based on using those tools. But when it comes to tabletop role-playing games that are a bit more focused on social interactions, you know, a typical role-playing game like Ars Magica, it's not always... You can play Ars Magica in a certain dungeon crawly sort of way, but it's a more rich or fulfilling experience if you interact with the different members of the clergy. You know, the clergy is basically like the bad guys in Ars Magica, or if you are playing as a knight that is going out to a certain place because your magician lords are not welcome in that place and you are acting as their agent, and you are talking with all of these different non-player characters, courtly intrigue, all of that. I think that in that case, miniatures can be a bit of a hindrance or obstacle because they are not needed at all. Maybe later on, if situations get out of hand and you need to put really like a zoom in level of tactics, then maybe you can use miniatures. But in most cases, I think that for the most part, you can only write some charts, make some small notes like, oh, this is the room, who knows what, which connects, and you draw a line to this other room. And maybe you make some small notes. This room contains a bed, a table, and a chest. This other room contains a fireplace, and there is a corpse in front of the fireplace. So yes, in most cases, when it comes to those types of role-playing games, it's much better to not to employ miniatures or maps. They are not necessary at all, especially if the system has a very more like freeform or loose system on how to adjudicate different spell effects, combat maneuvers, and such. But I personally love using miniatures and maps. It also takes me back to when I learned how to play Dungeons & Dragons with the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition box set, the Introduction to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. That box set came with 6 plastic miniatures, but no miniatures for the monsters. So I remember that I immediately went to my closet to look for this box. It was like, I don't know, maybe this game is sold in other countries, probably. But here in Mexico, it's called Ballestas and Catapultas. Bueno, Ballestas y Catapultas. I think it's translated to crossbows and catapults. I don't know, like I said, I don't know if that's the title in other places. But you have a bunch, it's great value, you have a bunch of plastic miniatures. Some of them are like in brown plastic. They look like somewhat agile or lithe barbarians, more like Vikings, you know, with the horned helmets. And you had these other warriors, the opposition, that were more like barbarians, maybe like Saxon warriors, but that look a bit more, a bit chunkier. They are a bit like, you know, barrel-chested. And they were perfect to represent all sorts of monsters. So they were fighting gnolls. I would use the skinny Vikings. And if they were fighting orcs, I would use the other ones. The ones that were a bit like chunkier, thicker. You also had like this hard plastic ammunition. You would use it with the crossbows. You had this oversized like a ballistae and catapults. You attached the rubber bands to those machines or contraptions, and you fired against the structures of your opponent. So those munitions are like little bullets. They had these stickers with monstrous faces. So they served to represent different monsters. And I also employed the plastic castle. You had like these, they kind of look like Legos, but they were not. They were bigger and sturdier because they needed to resist the attacks from the rubber band weapons. You could use them for all sorts of situations. So those were my props, my scenic elements when running Advanced Dungeons and Dragons way back then. And sometimes I still use them, depending on the situation. In some cases, it could be useful to have a more abstract representation of the enemies in the encounter, because if you have an enemy that is kind of like a roper or a gibbering mouther or something like that, that is quite deformed, monstrous, and you only have like humanoid figures, maybe it's much better to use like your typical board game pawn or token, so that the imagination takes over and you only use it for tactical purposes. But just overall, I think it's quite clear to see why miniatures, maps have survived. Some use those tools for practical purposes to determine the line of sight, the range of the template, of the spell, to see if you can charge at that opponent, if you can use your attack of opportunity with that polearm, etc. All of that. But it's certainly possible to get rid of them, but the more tactical oriented players may frown upon that. It all depends on what you like. I also think it's not a good idea to use them if they present a distraction. A few years back, several years back in fact, I had this weird situation. I commented this in another video, again like 3 years ago or more, where we were playing with this doctor. She was somewhat eccentric. When we were playing the game, she constantly kept taking the miniatures from the map and she started to move them around. And it was very troublesome for me because I needed to know the locations to apply the different spell effects. We were playing Pathfinder 1st edition and she kept moving the miniatures, and even though I told her to stop constantly, she didn't pay attention to me and she just kept doing it. But the reason why I kept her around, it was because she was a really good role player and she was only visiting. So I wanted those few days to be memorable. But later on, I understood why she kept doing that. First of all, she had a crush on someone at the table, so it was like the way to call attention, or yeah, like kind of like, look at me, senpai, or something. And I also knew that when she was little, her parents were very strict, and they didn't allow her to play. I don't know what sorts of games were allowed, but she had almost no dolls and such. So maybe it was like a repressed feeling of her to play around with the miniatures. Yes, but as long as the miniatures are not a distraction, I think it's also a good idea to use them. But overall, it's all about what you like to use. If you don't like to use miniatures or maps, just put them away. And if you like to use them, then enjoy yourself. That's why we play tabletop role-playing games. As long as you play a game in which you roleplay as well. I think the same thing could be said about props and perhaps dressing up. I personally don't like dressing up. But for example, if a player has to dress up for the occasion and that player actually roleplays, well, that's good enough for me if you're going to be roleplaying. And remember, if you haven't seen my video where I talk about the difference between acting and role-playing, I'm going to put a link in the description with some tips about that. But if the person gets into the game by dressing up, if that person actually role-plays, then go ahead and just do it. But I don't think it's necessary. But like I said, whatever would you call it, rocks your boat. Is that the correct way of saying it? Or whatever works for you. So yes, I hope this video was entertaining or informative perhaps. I would love to know your thoughts on using miniatures, maps, dungeon tiles. Do you think that they are useful? Maybe you use them for a while and you no longer use them, or maybe you didn't use them at all and now you are starting to use them in more tactically oriented tabletop role-playing games. Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching this video. Thank you so much to those of you that are going the extra mile to support the channel. If anyone else wishes to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.